The time is 12 minutes past 5. The head of an inquiry into the infection through blood transfusions of thousands of NHS patients with HIV or hepatitis C has recommended that survivors should be offered initial compensation payments of £100,000 each. More than 4,000 people who were infected during the 1970s and 80s will benefit if the government accepts the recommendation. Sir Brian Langstaff, who's chairing the public inquiry into the scandal, explained his conclusion.
Sir Robert Francis QC recommended interim payments because the payment of full compensation could not be delivered quickly. He made a compelling case that interim payments are needed now to alleviate suffering and further suffering, and I agree with him. And I'm obliged to recognise that the practical way to make payments swiftly is to do so through the current infected blood support schemes. And that's why I've decided to recommend that interim payments of no less than £100,000 are made to all the infected people and all the bereaved partners who are currently registered with the schemes, and those who register between now and the inception of any future scheme.
Sir Brian Langstaff, who's chairing the inquiry. Well, the government has said that it would carefully consider any recommendations. Let's find out more from our correspondent, Laura Trant. We need to wind back a bit first, Laura. Just remind us of some of the background of this.
Well, tens of thousands of patients with haemophilia and other blood disorders, they were infected with HIV and hepatitis C in what's been called the worst treatment disaster in the NHS's history. That's because they were given a specific type of treatment to help with their disorders, and that was infected. It was a new treatment at its time called factor concentrate, or factor 8. It was given to people from the mid-1970s until 1991. Now, that was made by pooling blood from up to 40,000 different donors. That's where the problem was. If one of those samples was infected, the whole entire batch became infected. So lots of people then contracted different viruses. That danger increased further when the concentrate, the treatment, was brought in from the US. There they were taking blood from groups of people who were known to be high risk. Now, some of the patients who became infected in the UK then unwittingly infected their family members with HIV, with hepatitis C, and people who were undergoing surgery then contracted hepatitis C, hepatitis B from blood transfusions. So tens of thousands of people were affected.
So this recommendation that this interim payment should be made immediately.
That's what they're saying. Now, just to remind you, the purpose of this independent public inquiry is to examine the circumstances in which men, women and children who were under the care of the NHS were given this treatment that was infected. Today, the chair, we just saw the clip of him, of the infected blood inquiry, Sir Brian Langstaff, said that victims would receive a payment of £100,000 each. Now, families and victims have been paid over the years in sort of a support. They've been given financial support, but this is the first time they've received directions to have actual compensation. So it's a key moment for families, for victims, in terms of an admission of responsibility.
Yeah, and the government said it will accept recommendations. So what happens next then, if this is just the interim compensation?
This is just interim compensation, and these are only recommendations. It is ongoing. The deadline for more evidence to be submitted to the inquiry has now been extended to the 16th of December. A government spokesperson has said they are going to take a look at this with the utmost urgency. And just a reminder that an independent study commissioned by the government and published last month said that compensation should be given to victims, to their family members, to cover costs of stigma, the impact on their life, their work, their lifestyles. That could run into billions of pounds.
For the moment, Laura, thank you. Laura Trant. Well, joining us now is Jason Evans, founder of the campaign group Factor 8. Who've been advocating on behalf of those infected or otherwise affected by the scandal. Jason, thank you very much for joining us. And the reason that you're part of this campaign is that your father, Jonathan, died in 1993. Tell us a little bit about him as a man. What was he like?
Well, I would be able to tell you more if it wasn't for the fact that he died when I was 4 years old in 1993. So my direct memories are few and far between. However, what I can tell you is that following his infection with hepatitis C and HIV, he became seriously ill and didn't have much of a life at all. He only found out about those infections in the summer of 1985, about 6 months after the hospital had known the results, and it ruined his and my mum's relationship and just in so many ways. I couldn't even begin to tell you.
No, the strain of that and the worry constantly would take its toll. What do you make of the significance of this interim compensation, which Sir Brian Langstaff has recommended today?
Well, it's certainly a big step forward. These £100,000 interim compensation payments he's recommended should be made to surviving victims and bereaved partners. It's really important just to perhaps correct something that was said in the intro there. These payments are limited to those persons. There are many hundreds of bereaved families who not only receive no ongoing support to date, but who it's not being recommended now will receive interim compensation. And that's because the government's position to date is that where an infected person has died and they were not in a relationship at the time of their death, the family is entitled to no support at all. And unfortunately, that does include arguably some of the worst impacted families. So we're talking about numerous cases where people were orphaned. You know, in particular, there's one young lady, both of her parents died when she was 9 years old. The father was infected with HIV, unwittingly infected the mother, and both of her parents died. And also parents whose children were infected. People died as young as 8, 9, 10 years old after being infected with HIV. They too, unfortunately, are eligible for no ongoing support, and it's not being suggested they receive an interim payment at this time. So we're only talking about a select number of bereaved families at this moment. However, that being said, Sir Robert Francis's wider report does recommend compensation for all victims and bereaved families. But it's got to be said, this is certainly a step in the right direction, and hopefully the government will act, and this will get, badly needed monies into the hands of victims.
Just briefly then, what happens with your campaign? How strongly do you feel the need to keep going, given that the sign is compensation's coming in some form?
Well, I think ultimately it's on us as campaigners now to get this over the line. What we have is a recommendation. That's all it is. Sir Robert Francis's report, which the government have been sat on since March of this year, recommended exactly the same thing. And to date, publicly facing, absolutely nothing has happened. The Paymaster General, Michael Ellis, has fobbed off any MP who's asked a question by saying we're working hard, but we've seen no results of that. So our campaign has to keep going to hopefully get this pushed over the line and get compensation to all victims, all bereaved families, and ultimately, and perhaps more importantly, to get the truth on record that this scandal was totally avoidable.
Jason Evans, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.